The morning the gate finally opened, I was sweeping debris from the third step. Not performing a ritual, not attempting a key sequence or a blood offering, or one of the 17 documented activation protocols that the Aranthi Scholarly Consortium had catalogued over the last 4 decades. I was using a broom made of bundled mountain reed, the same broom my father had used before me and his mother before him, and I was pushing a scattering of wind-blown grit and dried lichen off the wide stone step that the plateau wind deposits there every night without fail. It was the 43rd year I had done this. I was 46 years old. I moved to the second step. Then the first, the one that sits directly at the gate's threshold, where the stonework of the arch meets the stonework of the old Aranthi Plaza. I swept it the same way I swept the others. Then I pushed the broom a little further than I meant to, and the handle's butt struck the lower face of the arch, and I reached out to steady it, and my left palm came down flat on the gate's surface. I had touched the gate before. Every sweeper who has worked this site has touched it. You lean on it. You brace against it on cold days because the stone holds warmth in a way that ordinary plateau rock does not. I had touched this gate 10,000 times in 43 years. I had run my hands along the carved script. I had leaned my forehead against it once during a particularly bad winter when the cold was specific and mean. What happened this time was different. I felt it before I saw it. A warmth that was not ambient, not the stone's ordinary retention. A warmth that moved, that had direction, that came from somewhere inside the stone and traveled to my palm like a current finding its level. I held still. The broom was still in my right hand. My left palm was flat against the carved script at the gate's base. The first glyph lit. Lower left quadrant of the arch's interior face, about 12 feet off the ground, a symbol I had looked at for 43 years without knowing what it meant, which the consortium's linguists called the address mark, indicating the beginning of a direct statement. It came on in deep amber, not a flash, not a pulse, the way dawn comes slowly and then fully, and you could not say exactly when it had become light. A second glyph lit, then a third, a fourth. I did not move my hand. Behind me, on the broad, flat apron of cracked tile that opens before the gate, 41 members of the Valdeth Compact's second expedition had been packing their instruments into carrying cases with the slow, deliberate movements of people trying not to show how badly they wanted to be somewhere else. They had arrived 3 weeks earlier with portable resonance chambers, with a sealed transport crate of override modules the Compact's engineers had spent 11 years designing, with 2 linguists who between them had read everything ever written about the Aranthi Dominion in 17 living languages and 4 dead ones. They had attempted the gate on each of the 21 days since their arrival, using a different protocol each time, and the gate had ignored every one of them the way a mountain ignores rain. It was ignoring them again, right now, or it had been, until this moment. I heard them stop what they were doing. I heard, in the silence that followed, the soft chirp of recording equipment being activated with the muffled urgency of people trying to be fast without being disruptive. Thresh, Dr. Val's voice, very quiet from directly behind me. She was the Compact's team leader, a tall woman whose 3 weeks on this plateau I had read as carefully as I read all the expedition leaders, in the way they walk, the way they handle failure. She walked with her head up and her hands loose at her sides, pace completely even as if the failure had not yet landed. I had seen that in maybe 4 expedition leaders in 43 years. Can you hold position? Yes, I said. I had been in this exact spot, in one form or another, for 43 years. Holding position was not a problem. The gate was waking up. There is no other way to describe it. The inscription ran from the base of the arch to the crown in what the consortium's current best-read sequence identifies as a continuous statement, a single long sentence written to be read by someone approaching from the outside, moving upward with their eyes as they drew close. The glyphs were coming on in bands now, sections of script lighting together, working their way up the arch the way water fills a vessel. From the bottom, steadily, without hurry. I watched the lower bands complete, and I thought about the Pathrani coalition. They had come 15 years ago with the specific intention of forcing the gate. Their chief engineer had reviewed the consortium's published material, had concluded that the gate was sealed by a mechanical mechanism of Aranthi manufacture, and that this mechanism, however old, was subject to the same physical laws as any other mechanism, and that shaped demolition charges placed at the structural stress points of the arch would resolve the question definitively. The crater they left in the apron tile had been 12 feet across and 18 inches deep. I had spent 4 days filling it with cold set compound and resetting the tile around it, and during those 4 days, I had developed a comprehensive opinion about the Pathrani coalition's engineering judgment that I had never shared with anyone because nobody had asked me. Before them, the consortium's own first expedition, which had attempted 17 protocols over 40 days and retired with extensive documentation and no progress. Before that, the commercial consortium from 3 city-states who had brought the heaviest resonance equipment I had ever seen on this plateau, portaged up the steps on 48 mule loads, set up in a ring around the gate's base, and run for 11 straight days. Their chief engineer had come to stand beside me on the last day while I swept, watched the gate in silence, then said, "What do you think it wants?" I said I didn't know. He said, "You've been here longer than anyone. You must have a theory." I thought about it honestly. I said, "I think it wants what it was built to wait for." He said, "That's not very helpful." I said, "No, but it might be true." He packed his equipment and went back down the mountain. The gate stood exactly as it had always stood. The pilgrim cults came periodically, which was their nature. There was a community in the lower city whose theology had organized itself around the belief that the gate would open at a specific astronomical alignment, and they climbed the steps to observe each alignment with appropriate ceremony, and the gate did not open at any of them, and they revised their calculations and came back, as cults do. The solitary scholars who camped on the apron for months at a stretch. I had been sweeping steps around encamped scholars since I was a child. One of them, an older woman named Kauren Vel, who had been on the plateau 3 times before I was born and returned twice more after, used to tell me that watching a thing that refused to answer was still a form of conversation. I did not understand what she meant when I was young. I understood it better now. Their chief engineer had reviewed the consortium's published material, had concluded that the gate was sealed by a mechanical mechanism of Aranthi manufacture, and that this mechanism, however old, was subject to the same physical laws as any other mechanism, and that shaped demolition charges placed at the structural stress points of the arch would resolve the question definitively. The crater they left in the apron tile had been 12 feet across and 18 inches deep. The gate had been without a scratch. I had spent 4 days filling that crater with cold set compound and resetting the tile around it, and during those 4 days, I had developed a comprehensive opinion about the Pathrani coalition's engineering judgment that I had never shared with anyone because nobody had asked me. The 4th Kithran delegation had arrived the same year I turned 30. A prince named Sarath Valin who came up the 412 steps in full ceremonial armor, despite the altitude, followed by 43 attendants, and stood before the gate for 6 hours performing the activation, writes his scholars had reconstructed from secondary sources, calling out in his best attempt at the old Aranthi formal register, his voice going hoarser as the hours passed, his certainty converting to something else in stages. The armor looked less ceremonial in the afternoon light than it had in the morning. When he finally came back down past me, I was patching mortar on the 14th step. He stopped and looked at me for a moment. I am not certain what he expected from a stepkeeper on a cold mountain. Whatever it was, he did not find it, and he went on. The light was a third of the way up the arch now. Behind me, I heard the linguists moving to better positions, instruments tracking, and under that I could hear the quality of the silence on the apron changing. 41 people trying to be invisible while watching something they had been waiting for professionally for years. I thought about what the gate had felt like on the days those delegations had stood before it. This is something I had never told anyone. The stone's warmth was not constant. On days when expeditions were working in close proximity, it had a quality that ordinary days did not. Not visible, I had never seen it light, not until this morning. But the stone felt different under the hand. Slightly warmer than the ambient temperature could account for, or occasionally cooler, in a way that seemed to correspond to something about the expedition itself rather than the weather. I had spent years not mentioning this because I am a practical man, and I had no explanation for it that would have improved a conversation. I had mentioned it once to my father. I was maybe 20 years old, and we were doing the annual drainage check together, and I pressed my palm to the gate's lower face and said, "It feels like it's thinking." My father pressed his own palm flat against the stone beside mine, held it there for a moment. Then he said, "It probably is." That was all. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask, because in my family there was an understanding that the gate was the gate and you did not speculate about it. You kept it clean. You gave it the attention it was owed, and in return it stood where it had always stood. That was the whole of the arrangement. I think now that my father knew more than he said. I think the warmth in the stone had spoken to him the way it was speaking to me now, in that non-language below language, and that he had answered it the same way I was answering it, by giving it the truth without knowing why the truth was what it needed. I think that conversation had been going on in my family for generations, in the palms of our hands, without any of us understanding what we were a party to. The light was halfway up the arch. The color was changing as it rose, the amber of the lower register warming toward something deeper, not hotter, not harsher, but fuller, the way certain stones look when the right angle of light hits them, and you see for the first time that what you thought was gray is actually full of color. By the time the illumination reached the midpoint, the gate had a warmth to it that was almost physical, a pressure of light that you felt on your skin the way you feel the sun after a cold stretch of weeks, not the heat of it but the presence of it, the sense of something turned toward you that has mass and intention. One of the expedition members said, in a voice they had not fully controlled, "Oh." The Aranthi Gate stands at the highest point of Kauren Vel, which is the highest point of the plateau, which is itself the highest point on this side of the Kauren Range, a position so elevated that on clear days you can see the curve of the horizon from the top step, and on stormy ones the clouds come in below you. The gate is an arch of blackened stone, 140 feet high at the crown, broad enough at its base to drive a column of heavy vehicles through 6 abreast. Every surface is carved. Not decorated, carved. The carvings are so dense and so precise that from 20 feet away they look like texture, like the grain of some impossibly fine stone, and only up close do you realize that every square inch of that texture is script. The Aranthi wrote on everything. They wrote on their buildings, their tools, their weapons, their dead. The gate was their greatest surface, and they used all of it. The arch frames nothing. Visitors always say this first when they arrive and climb the 412 steps from the lower plaza, they say, but there's nothing there. And they mean the gate opens onto open air. No door, no membrane, no wall. You can walk through it from either side and nothing happens, except the carvings change as you pass. The script on the interior faces runs in a different direction than the exterior faces, which the consortium scholars call a bidirectional reading structure, a scholarly way of saying the gate talks to you differently depending on which way you're going. When it talks to you at all. For 912 years, it had not talked to anyone. I had seen it in the 3 authenticated images from before the fall, the gate fully lit, every glyph burning, the whole arch a column of warm light rising from the plateau into the sky. The last time it had looked like that, the Aranthi Dominion had still existed. It looked like that now. I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Pella Thresh. She had held this contract for 22 years before she died on the mountain in a bad winter storm, the kind that hits Kauren Vel from the northwest without warning, all ice and horizontal wind. The labor records go back further than her, Threshes on this plateau for at least 140 years by the city contracts. Before that, the family story was that we had come from the mountainside, had always been on the mountainside, had never in living memory been anywhere else. She had one habit my father described to me many times. She kept the drainage channels around the gate's base clear of lichen and mineral buildup. The specific lichen that grows in the carved lines of this stone produces mineral deposits that, over decades, fill the finest cuts and render the script illegible. My grandmother had understood this about stone without understanding anything about the Aranthi or their inscriptions. She was a professional who took maintenance seriously. She cleared the channels because that was part of the work, and you did not leave part of the work undone. Because of that, the gate's lower register is more legible today than it would have been otherwise. Two of the consortium's current theories rest on readings from the lower register that would not have been possible if she had let the lichen run. Nobody had ever thanked her for that. She died in a storm before the consortium arrived. I had one photograph of her, standing on the apron before the gate with a wide-bladed clearing tool in her left hand, looking at something just off-frame to the right, her head turned. She looked like she was listening. I had always thought she was listening to the gate. The light reached the crown. The gate did not swing. There was no pivot, no hinge, no mechanical operation of any visible kind. What happened was that the air inside the arch, the column of open air that the gate frames, that for 912 years had been simply a view of the plateau and the sky beyond, changed. Dr. Val told me later, and she is a precise woman, that what she saw was the air inside the arch taking on depth. As if the column of space suddenly went further back than the plateau should allow. As if something behind the arch was opening, even though there was nothing behind the arch but more mountain. I pressed my palm harder against the stone. The warmth had reached a steadiness now, not increasing, not decreasing, just present, like the warmth of a hand that has been holding yours long enough that you stop noticing where your heat ends and theirs begins. And in that steadiness I became aware of something I do not know how to classify. Not a sound, not a voice in the air. Something between hearing and understanding. A sense of being addressed that did not require the ears at all. The way you sometimes know the content of a dream upon waking without being able to say you heard anything. It was asking me something. I cannot tell you what it asked because I cannot translate the experience into language. What the gate was asking, through my palm and the carved lines, felt like identity but was not exactly identity. It was not asking who I was. It was asking what I was, at a level more fundamental than name or role, asking for the trace of something older and more specific that would either be there or not be there, and my answer would either complete the circuit or leave it open. What I answered with was the truth as I knew it. I am Davin Thresh. I sweep the steps here. My family has swept the steps here for as long as my family can remember. I don't know what you are waiting for. I don't know if I am it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. That is all I had. That is exactly what I gave. The arch blazed. Not the steady amber of the build, a single full-intensity surge that hit every carved surface simultaneously, floor to crown, every glyph at once, and the light off the arch threw shadows behind every person on the apron, and the shadows went straight back and hard, the way midday sun makes shadows, and it was not midday, and there was no sun in that direction. Several expedition members stepped back involuntarily. I heard someone grip an instrument case very tightly. Dr. Val, who did not step back, exhaled once, a breath she had been holding since the first glyph lit. The depth inside the arch completed. I had a moment, standing there with the blaze still ringing in the stone under my hands, to understand what I was feeling. Not triumph. Not the vindication of a man who has been right about something for a long time. Something quieter and harder than either of those. The feeling of a door opening onto a room you did not know existed and realizing that you have been walking past it every day of your life. That the frame of it was always in the wall. That the only thing that was ever required was for the right hand to find the right stone. My father's voice, you are only keeping the terms of it honest. 43 years of honest terms, and the wall had opened. Where there had been open air framing a view of the plateau's far edge, there was now something else, a space that had no business being there. A room or corridor glimpsed through the arch, lit in the same amber as the gate's inscription but steadier, calmer, the light of a place that has been waiting with the patient confidence of something that knew this moment was coming. Tall space, carved walls, a floor that had not collected 9 centuries of grit and debris, which meant either that what lay beyond the gate was somewhere else entirely, or that whatever was on the other side had been maintaining itself without any help from anyone. The gate had been keeping its own interior clean. I held on to that thought for a second. Then I let it go, because I could feel what was coming next and I wanted to be fully present for it. Dr. Val stepped up beside me, very close, not touching. "Thresh," she said, "what do you feel? Is there anything specific you can tell me?" I thought about this seriously before I answered. "It's warm," I said. "Not painful, just warm, like—" I searched for the right comparison. "Like a hand you forgot was there." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can you put your other hand on it?" I put my other hand on it. The gate's voice, which is the only word I have for what happened next, even though it was not a voice in any conventional sense. The gate's statement, the thing it had been charged to say to the right person and had been holding for 912 years without relief, came to me the way the warmth had come, through my palms and up my arms and then everywhere at once, the way a sound you feel as much as hear fills a room. But I also heard it. In the air, clearly, in a language I had never been taught and nonetheless understood with perfect completeness. 5 words, spoken once, at a volume that was neither loud nor soft but simply present, the way important things are present when they finally arrive. "Home has waited, my king." I stayed where I was, both palms flat against the carved stone, the warmth steady under my hands, the gate fully open behind me and the impossible room visible through the arch and the entire Valdeth compact expedition absolutely still on the apron, every one of them not breathing. The words sat in the plateau air for a moment. Then they settled into me the way a key settles into a lock, not with force, not with noise, but with the particular click of something finding its fit. I am going to try to tell you what it was like to receive them, and I will probably fail, but I am going to try. There is a category of understanding that is not the same as thinking. It bypasses the mechanism thinking uses, the sequential logic that assembles a conclusion from its components, and delivers the conclusion whole, already complete, already carrying its full weight. When someone you love dies, you understand it this way. Not as a series of facts that lead to the understanding, but as a single arrived knowledge that has all the facts already incorporated. You don't think your way to it. It's there. And then you spend the rest of your time thinking your way through it. What arrived in me when the gate spoke was that kind of understanding. I was the last blood of the Aranthi ruling line. The Thresh family had not been on this plateau because the work was available and they needed it. They had been here because this is where the bloodline had come to rest at the end of the Aranthi Dominion's last decade, when whatever catastrophe or departure had ended that civilization stripped away everything above the labor class and left the people at the base of the social structure still standing, still working, still doing what they had always done because the skills they held were older than the empire and would outlast it. My family had been the most ordinary people imaginable, doing the most ordinary work imaginable, and the Aranthi succession had hidden in that ordinariness the way water hides in stone, not visibly, not dramatically, just present, waiting for the right conditions to surface. The gate had not been waiting for a king to arrive and claim it. It had been waiting for the blood to be close enough, long enough, for the accumulation of contact to reach the threshold where recognition became possible. Not a single dramatic touch, not a ceremonial approach with genealogical documentation. 140 years of daily hands on stone, building toward the morning when the signal finally resolved. 140 years. I could feel, in the silence on the apron, the moment arriving when I would need to understand what had just been said to me. I let it arrive slowly. I am not a king. I have never been a king. I have never trained for a role, inherited a title, been told that something particular was expected of me. I swept steps. I checked drainage channels. I packed sealant into stress fractures on cold mornings, and I watched expedition after expedition fail at the thing I had spent my entire working life providing access to, never thinking that the access I was providing was my own access, never understanding that the maintenance of this gate had been, for 140 years of Thresh family labor, the gate maintaining its connection to the only bloodline that could open it. We had not been employed to keep the gate clean. We had been living here, staying close, as the gate had needed us to stay close, and none of us had ever known. I thought about my father's hands, shaped like mine, same wide palm, same habit of pressing the flat of the hand to stone when checking quality. I thought about his mother's hands, which I had only seen in the single photograph my father kept, a working portrait taken during a consortium survey. The same hands. I thought about how many times those hands had rested on this stone, had swept this threshold, had been exactly here, and whether the gate had felt them the way it was feeling me now, had recognized in them what it recognized in me, had simply been waiting for the generation whose contact would be strong enough to complete whatever circuit needed completing. Whether they had felt it too, some fraction of this warmth, and not known what it was. My father had held this contract for 31 years before his knees gave out. The cold on the mountain is specific about knees, worrying at them through the winters until at some point they simply declined to negotiate further. He had taught me this work the way he had learned it, which is to say he had stood beside me and done it, and I had watched and done it alongside him, and the teaching had never been spoken aloud because the work itself was the instruction. You swept the steps from the top, not the bottom, so the grit moved downward in the direction gravity wanted it to go. You cleared the drainage channels twice yearly, before the heavy rains and before the deep freeze, and not once between if you could help it, because disturbance between seasons did more harm than the buildup itself. You checked the condition of the sealant in the mortar joints every spring with 2 fingers, not instruments, fingers, because what you were measuring was the cure, which has a particular yielding quality under pressure when it's right and a brittleness when it isn't that no instrument I've been shown conveys as clearly as the fingertip. He had learned this from his mother. She had learned it, presumably, from whoever taught her. The knowledge moved through hands. My grandmother clearing the lichen from the drainage channels on a morning she had no reason to think was anything other than ordinary. My father pressing his palm to the stone and saying, "It probably is thinking." My grandfather's father, or whoever was before him, showing up in the city labor records as a contracted stone keeper with no documented history before the mountain, as if the mountain were simply where he had always been. As if the mountain were simply where he had always been. The thought was not comfortable. I let it be uncomfortable. Dr. Val spoke carefully. "Davin," she said. She used my given name for the first time. The inscription at the crown of the arch, the final band of the sequence, it's lit differently than the rest. Brighter. Our instruments are reading it as an active register, not a static one. Do you understand what I mean by that? "It's still saying something," I said. "It's still saying something. Whatever the gate is, whatever it was built to do, it's doing it right now. A pause. Are you all right? Was I all right? The gate of the Aranthi Dominion had been sealed for 912 years. It had refused the blood claims of 14 dynasties, the override attempts of 7 engineering teams, the prayers and petitions of more religious delegations than anyone had properly counted. And it had opened when a man who swept steps put his hands on it and told it only the truth, that he was nobody in particular, and didn't know if he was what it was looking for, but wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I don't know yet, I said, which was also the truth. She accepted that. That is something I have always thought well of in Dr. Vel. She could receive an honest answer without requiring it to be larger than it was. Behind her, I could hear the expedition's 2 linguists in rapid conversation with their recording equipment, reading inscription fragments aloud into captured devices, their voices overlapping in the slightly frantic rhythm of scholars who have just been handed something they have been waiting their whole careers for. The engineer was on a communication device, trying to convey what was happening to someone not present in a way that made sense, and failing, which is what happens when you try to convey a thing like this to someone who is not standing in front of it. I stayed where I was. The gate was not going anywhere. It had waited 912 years, and now whatever it was waiting for was here, and it was not going to hurry the conclusion. The warmth under my palms was steady. The light off the arch was steady. The depth through the arch, the room beyond, the waiting interior, was steady. Everything held with the patience of something that has been holding this moment in reserve for a very long time and knows the value of it. I began to understand why I had never felt afraid. Not because the gate wasn't powerful. It was extraordinarily powerful, a piece of engineering from a civilization whose best work had outlasted them by nearly 1,000 years, now fully operational for what appeared to be the first time in that span. It was the most significant active artifact on this side of the Kithrin Range, and almost certainly the most significant on any side. But it was not threatening me. The warmth in the carved script was not coercive, not demanding, not pulling, not insisting on anything. It had said what it was charged to say, and now it was waiting again, but the quality of the waiting was different. This was not the sealed, airless waiting of something denied its purpose. This was the waiting of something that has arrived, discharged its central function, that is now available, present, ready to be used in whatever way the appropriate person chose to use it. The gate had done its job, the rest was up to me. I took my hands off the stone. The gate stayed open. I turned around, which meant turning to face the 41 members of the Valdeth Compact's second expedition, arranged across the carved apron in an informal semicircle that had formed without anyone organizing it. The natural arrangement of a group of people who all have a clear sight line on something extraordinary and are not moving because they are afraid of disturbing it. Dr. Vel in front of them, slightly set apart, looking at me with the expression of a woman who has just revised her understanding of several things she thought she understood. Behind her, the linguist's instruments were still running, still tracking. "I need to tell you something," I said. Not the speech of a king. I am still Davin Thresh. The broom was leaning against the gate's base 12 feet to my left, and I intended to finish using it before the day was done. But I was aware, in a way I had not been 2 hours before, that what I was about to say had been accumulating for a long time, assembling itself from 140 years of my family's labor and 912 years of the gate's holding, and that however ordinary I was, what I was about to say was not going to sound ordinary. I told them what the gate had said, not the translation, the linguists had that. Their instruments had captured the active register output, and they were already working through the phonological record. I told them what it had meant, what it had felt like when it landed. Not because they needed to know what Davin Thresh felt when a 900-year-old gate named him by a title he had not known he held, but because understanding the gate's intent, understanding that this had been a message, not a mechanism, that the Aranthi had built something meant to wait and to recognize and to welcome, was going to matter for what came next. Dr. Val listened without taking notes, which was unlike her. The linguists listened with their recording devices still running. The engineer listened with the particular focused attention of someone trying to reconcile what they're hearing with what they know about how things work, and not quite getting there. When I finished, nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the linguists, a younger man named Vel, a specialist in Aranthi symbolic grammar, said very quietly, "The Dominion's succession line." "Yes," I said. "The line that the histories say ended with the fall." Apparently it didn't. He looked at me, not with the look of someone who has found something and intends to broadcast it loudly. He looked at me the way people look when they have understood something they did not expect to understand and are still absorbing the shape of it. "Your family has been here," he said, not a question. "For at least 140 years by the city records, probably longer. The family story says we've always been on the mountain." "Always being on the mountain," he said slowly, "is one way to maintain a bloodline's proximity to the object it's tied to." "Yes," I said, "that's what I think too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The gate was never waiting for someone to arrive." "No," I said. "It was waiting for someone to already be here." He said this the way you say something that you have just heard yourself say and are simultaneously confirming and being surprised by. The contact had to be cumulative, long enough and close enough and honest enough maybe. It wasn't a single activation event. It was waiting for the right blood to be present for long enough that the gate could be certain. 140 years is a long time to be certain, I said. "That's how long it was waiting to be certain," he said. "That's the threshold it set." He sat down on the apron tile, cross-legged, right there, with the gate open and blazing 30 feet behind me. His legs had apparently decided to stop negotiating. One of the other linguists put a hand on his shoulder, and he reached up and held it without looking away from the middle distance where he was working through the implications. I understood what they were feeling. The implications of what the gate had done were going to take a very long time to work through, and the working through was not going to be simple or quiet. Every claim any dynasty had ever made to the Aranthi succession was now definitively answered by the gate itself, in the gate's own language, in the active register that only operated when the correct blood contact completed the circuit. The Kithrin reaches 14 royal delegations, each one bearing genealogical documents certified by their most respected scholars. The gate had looked at every one of them and said nothing. It had looked at Davin Thresh, stonekeeper's son, broom in hand, thinking about drainage sealant, and had said, "Home has waited, my king." That was either the most extraordinary accident in recorded history, or it was exactly what the gate was built to do, recognize one specific thing, and wait patiently for as long as it took for that thing to appear. The Aranthi had not believed the fall was permanent. That was the conclusion trying to surface in me as I stood looking at 41 stunned scholars. They had sealed this gate not as a monument to what they had been, not as a heritage site for future civilizations to study, but as an active mechanism tied to a specific bloodline, charged to keep itself sealed until the right blood touched it, however long that took. They had embedded the succession in the survival of the people, and they had trusted that the people would stay close to the gate without knowing why, because people who have always been somewhere tend to stay somewhere. And 140 years of city labor records, plus the family stories, meant the Thresh family had been on this plateau for a very long time, with no documented reason to be here other than the work. We had stayed close because we were the kind of people who stay close to the work. We had maintained the gate because we were the kind of people who take maintenance seriously. We had pressed our hands to the stone 10,000 times in the course of ordinary labor, and felt warmth that we thought was just thermal retention. And all of it, every generation of it, every winter morning and every swept step and every packed sealant repair, and every hour my grandmother Pella spent clearing mineral deposits from carved lines so the record would be legible, all of it had been the bloodline staying present, without drama, without knowledge, without any sense that anything was required of us except the work itself. The Aranthi had trusted the right people. That thought landed in me very quietly, and it sat there, and it did not move. The Aranthi had trusted not their nobles, not their scholar class, not the careful genealogical chains that their inheritor civilizations had been constructing and contesting for 9 centuries. They had trusted the people who stayed close to the stone, who showed up every morning, who kept the drainage clear without being asked, who found the honest argument between effort and futility and honored it. My father's voice, very clear in the back of my mind, "You are not trying to win it. You are only keeping the terms of it honest." They had built a gate that recognized that kind of honesty. Dr. Val had moved to stand beside me, at an angle, looking at the gate rather than at me. The gate's light was full on her face, the deep amber warmth of it, the steady pulse of the active register inscription at the crown. "What does it feel like?" she said, not quite asking, mostly thinking aloud, "to have been doing the right thing your whole life without knowing it was the right thing?" I thought about that for a moment, honestly, carefully. "The same as it feels to do it knowing," I said. "The work is the same work." She turned to look at me. Something shifted in her expression, a kind of recognition that was not about the gate. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." She looked back at the gate. The amber light was steady, patient, full. After a moment she said, "The room beyond the arch, it's been maintained. The lighting, the quality of the space, nothing in there has deteriorated." "No," I said. "Which means either it's somewhere outside normal conditions, outside the plateau entirely, possibly outside this dimension if the Aranthi engineering goes where some of the more speculative scholarship has suggested, a pause. Or the gate has been maintaining it, actively, for 912 years. "Yes," I said. She was quiet. "The Aranthi built something to wait for you," she said finally. "And while it waited, it kept your house clean." I had not thought of it in those words, but she was not wrong. I began to understand what king meant in the Aranthi context, which was not what it meant in the Kithran context or any other political context I had the vocabulary for. The Aranthi did not, as best anyone understood, have kings in the sense their successor civilizations did, hereditary hierarchs whose authority was absolute and whose legitimacy was performed through ceremony and force. What they had was closer to custodians, people responsible for specific things, people who were accountable, first and last, to the object of their custodianship, rather than to the people beneath them or the traditions above them. In the Aranthi's best reconstructed social philosophy, and the consortium's linguists had spent 30 years on this reconstruction, so I have some confidence in the outline even if the details remain contested. The highest role in any society was not the one that commanded, but the one that maintained, the role that ensured the continuation of the thing worth continuing, the one that showed up regardless of recognition, regardless of compensation, regardless of the question of whether anyone would notice if the work was done or left undone. The Aranthi word for this role, which the scholars transliterate as Karathan, is usually translated as king or sovereign, but some scholars argue that keeper is more accurate, or even guardian of the threshold, not because the term describes a subordinate position, but because in the Aranthi understanding, the one who kept the threshold was the highest position, the one everything else depended on. The keeper of the threshold was the king. I had been keeping this threshold for 43 years. My father had kept it for 31. His mother had kept it for 22. A line of keepers in direct succession for at least 140 years. And the gate had been watching all of it and measuring all of it and waiting for the morning when the accumulated weight of all that keeping was enough. A kind of glorified sweeper, in other words. The thought nearly made me laugh. I let myself smile at it instead. What kind of civilization designs for its own absence? One that knows the absence is coming, or one that does not care whether it comes? One that is more interested in what it leaves behind than in whether it stays to see the leaving? The gate was their most ambitious statement, and they had written it not in the language of power or conquest, but in the language of fidelity. A door that would stay shut until the right blood arrived, however many centuries it took. That was not a monument. That was a letter, and my family had been living on its doorstep for 140 years, keeping the envelope clean. Verl was still sitting on the apron, but he had a small notebook out now, the handwritten kind scholars use when they need to think faster than a device allows, and he was writing in it in the rapid, cramped hand of someone trying to capture something before it settles into a shape they can no longer see. He looked up at me. "The inscription sequence," he said. "If the gate was building toward address from the moment of first contact, if the address mark was the first glyph, and the sequence ran in order from there," he stopped. "How long do you think the sequence was meant to take?" I thought about this. I had watched it build for perhaps 15 minutes from first glyph to crown. "I don't know," I said. "Is it significant?" The Aranthi appear to have designed processes that took exactly as long as the participant needed them to take, he said. Not as long as was technically necessary, as long as was emotionally necessary, for the message to be received properly. He looked at the notebook. 15 minutes might be the gate's assessment of how long you needed. I stood very still for a moment. 15 minutes. From the first warmth in the carved lines to the moment, I had put both hands on the stone and given the gate everything I had. The gate had given me 15 minutes to understand what was happening, to find the truth inside myself that it was asking for, to arrive at the point where what I said to it was the fullest truth I knew. 15 minutes for a man who had been standing at this threshold for 43 years. That seemed about right. I thought about the Kithrin prince, Sarath Valen, standing before the gate for 6 hours in full ceremonial armor, calling out in reconstructed Aranthi formal register. His scholars had given him the best protocol they could reconstruct from secondary sources. His genealogists had given him the most respectable blood claim his dynasty's records could support. He had climbed 412 steps in armor that weighed what heavy armor weighs, and he had stood there for 6 hours, and the gate had given him nothing. Not because his claim was false, not because his intent was wrong or his scholars were incompetent or his voice was bad, but because none of those things were what the gate was measuring. The gate was measuring proximity, contact, the cumulative weight of days. It was measuring the kind of presence that cannot be performed for an afternoon, even an afternoon that lasts 6 hours. The kind of presence that is only legible after years of it, after the years have settled into the stone the way a hand settles into the worn grip of a tool it has used for a very long time. Prince Sarath Valen had come to claim the gate. My family had simply come to keep it. The gate apparently knew the difference. And I thought, what would the Aranthi have made of the dynasties that came after them? The careful genealogical arguments, the blood test protocols, the formal petitions in reconstructed language. Would they have recognized themselves in the ambition, in the desire for the succession to be transferable, claimable, documented? Or would they have looked at all of it, all the expeditions, all the attempts, all 912 years of humanity's most sophisticated efforts to open a door, and seen something that missed the point so completely it had not occurred to anyone to even ask the right question? Not how do we open the gate, but has the gate's person simply not arrived yet? The gate had a person. That was the design. One person, one bloodline, however long the wait, however far the blood traveled from its origin. The gate would hold until that person stood at its threshold and gave it what it needed, which was not a claim or a ceremony or a code, but a presence, an honesty, a life spent close enough to the stone that the stone knew them by their hands. I am not a sentimental man. I have spent too many winters on this mountain to have much sentiment left for anything that doesn't hold up to cold and wind. But standing on the apron with the gate open behind me and the amber light steady and warm, I felt something that I will describe as accurately as I can. I felt the weight of every person who had tried. Not with contempt, not with pity, but with the particular recognition you have for people who were working as hard as they could at the wrong thing. All that effort, all that scholarship, all those carefully reconstructed protocols and precisely certified blood claims. All of it had been sincerely meant, and all of it had been beside the point, and none of them had known, and I had not known, and the gate had known all along. The gate had been the only patient one in the room, for 912 years. The gate behind me stood open, the room beyond it waited. In 4 decades on this plateau, I had developed a professional sense for when a day's work was properly finished, and when it had more to give, and I had that sense now, looking at the open arch and the waiting light beyond, not a conclusion, a hinge, the moment when the setup ends and the real question begins. I was 46 years old. I had a broom leaning against the gate's base. I had a drainage channel to check on the northeast foot and a crack sealant repair to evaluate. Whatever the gate was waiting for me to do now, and I was fairly certain it was waiting, that the open arch and the steady light were an invitation extended with full patience, without deadline that would take time to understand. It would require the consortium's linguists and Dr. Val's engineering team, and every scholar who had ever spent a career on the Aranthi question. It would require me to understand what lay in that waiting room, what obligations came with the recognition the gate had spoken, and what it meant to be the last of a line that had survived the fall not in palaces or exile, but in the hands of the people who kept the stone clean. There would be consequences. I was not naive enough to think otherwise. The city below would hear about this before nightfall. The compact's engineer was already on his communication device, and news of the gate's opening would travel at the speed of people who cannot keep themselves from talking about extraordinary things. There would be scholars arriving in numbers I had not seen before. There would be political delegations with revised claims, or new claims, or claims that attempted to argue that the gate's recognition of a stonekeeper's blood was somehow misinterpreted, misread, a technical anomaly rather than an intentional statement. There would be people who needed what lay beyond the gate for reasons that had nothing to do with the Aranthi or their philosophy of custodianship. I was going to have to navigate all of that, with no training for it, no staff, no understanding beyond what the gate had told me, and what 43 years of watching people arrive and fail had taught me about human ambition. But I had something those people would lack. I had been here. I had been here every morning for 43 years doing the work, and the work had taught me things that no amount of scholarly preparation would have given me. I knew what the gate felt like when it was ignoring someone. I knew the quality of the stone's warmth and what it meant when the warmth changed. I knew the drainage channels. I knew the stress fracture on the northeast foot and whether the sealant had held, which it had. I knew the 412 steps by feel, every one of them. Knew the 3 steps that had been recut by a different mason and felt different underfoot. Knew the place on the 208th step, where the plateau wind always came through a gap in the old retaining wall at an angle that was colder than the ambient temperature by several degrees, in a way that caught you unprepared every time if you had not been paying attention. I knew this place, every stone of it. The gate had not chosen me despite that knowledge, it had chosen me because of it. That seemed worth something. That seemed like enough of a foundation to stand on while the consequences arrived. I was prepared for that. I had been preparing for 43 years without knowing what I was preparing for, and the preparation had been the work itself. Not the study of protocols, not the cultivation of anything kingly, Just the daily honest engagement with the task in front of me, done to the best of my ability, without drama, without the expectation of recognition. The recognition had arrived anyway. That seemed right. That seemed, in fact, like the most Aranthi thing possible. I picked up the broom. Dr. Val watched me pick it up without saying anything. "I'm going to check the northeast channel before the light goes," I said. "The sealant I packed last month, I need to see if the frost got into it." A pause. "Thresh," she said. "Dr. Val, the gate is open." "Yes," I said. "It is." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the open gate. Then she looked back at me with an expression that would eventually, when she had had enough time and distance to process the day, become the description she used in her published account of the second expedition. An expression she would describe, in the dry measured language of academic prose, as composed certainty, as if the question had been answered some time before and he was simply catching up to the answer. I walked to the northeast foot and knelt beside the channel, and pressed 2 fingers into the sealant line to check the cure. It had held, the frost had not gotten in. I stood up, I looked at the gate. It looked back. I had been keeping this threshold for 43 years, and I understood, in the quiet of that high plateau afternoon, with the linguists working and the engineer measuring and Dr. Val standing very still in the full light of what the gate had become. I understood that the gate had been keeping me in the same way, with the same patience, the same daily attention, the same absolute refusal to let the terms between us become anything less than honest. "Home has waited, my king." "Yes," I thought, "I know. I have been here the whole time." The mountain held the moment in its cold, indifferent way, the way mountains hold all moments, without comment, without preference, without any sense that what is happening at their feet is extraordinary or ordinary or anything except what it is. The gate was open. The work was done. Tomorrow the wind would bring more debris and I would sweep the steps again, and now I would know why. That was enough. That had always been enough.